Hey everybody, I'm APH and welcome back to my beginner's guide for the Farthest Frontier. Today we are revisiting farms as recent updates to the game and my understanding has changed dramatically. Now getting started, the first update has to do with the amount of labors required for small fields. Opening up your build menu under food production, we are going to go ahead and select the crop field. A 5x5 now requires 2 workers versus the one before. Now in order to get back to that 25 tiles per worker, we would have to go with a 10x5. Yielding 2 workers and 50 tiles, that is roughly the same as before. You could go with a 7x7 for 49 tiles for those 2 workers and get roughly the same amount of yield. Now maximizing our farm gives us a 12x12 with 7 workers, which is roughly 20 tiles per worker. This means the Goldilocks zone is somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 tiles per worker. My preference is an 8x8 with 3 workers, roughly 21 tiles per worker. We have a 3-year crop rotation. To go with that 3-year crop rotation, I would recommend doing 3 farms as we want to produce the same crop every year. Now jumping into the crop rotations themselves, we have our next update in the game, and that is to do with the tooltip for fertility. It now shows the exact number for fertility impact versus the RNG number that it showed before. Now how this works is clover gets a +3. The 2 items in the beans category, beans and peas, get a +1. Under the root vegetables, we have turnips and carrots, which both get a -2. In the flax category, we get a -3. Then wheat is divided between wheat being a -6, buckwheat being a -2, and rye being a -5. And then moving down into the green category, we have cabbage at a -4 and leeks at a -5. Now these categories are pretty important as these categories are the categories that we want to group our crops in. We never want to run the same group more than once in a rotation. So if we were to grow either beans or peas, we would not want to grow the other one in the same farm. And then clover, we can run every single year, as far as I can tell, it is immune to pest and disease. Now maintenance is our way of maintaining weeds and rockiness, and it alleviates our need to look at the rockiness and weed suppression, but there is some min-max where you can kind of get around the weeds and rockiness by pairing it with that, which only means we have frost and heat tolerance to go by. With this, my recommendation for your first year, start off with turnips. Now the reason for turnips, it has a frost resistance. From there, go into a maintenance and end your year with clover. Now this will give us a +1 fertility over the course of the year. Dropping down to our second year, we want to rotate to a different type of crop. I recommend beans for this one. So we would simply start off with clover, and then because beans have a low frost resilience but a high heat tolerance, we want it to be in the middle of the year. So drop that second and try to make sure it's right in the middle. Between this, we have 1 fertility from the first year, we have 3 from the clover and 1 from the beans, bringing us to +5. Moving into the final year, now we rotate into our final crop, always leading off with clover, with the exception of our first year. Now we get the opportunity at a total of +8 fertility. We can choose any crop that we want and still be fertility positive. Now my recommendation will come with spoilage in a minute, so kind of understand this. If you are pre-windmill, you want greens. If you're after the windmill, you want grains. And if you need clothes, you want flax. For simplicity reasons, I'm going to go ahead and choose flax. We're going to go into spoilage in just a minute here. Flax again has a heat tolerance but not a frost tolerance, so you want it in the middle, and you want your crops slightly staggered as all of your farmers act as one unit, so they will go to farm to do the harvest, and if all your harvests are the same time, you will run into issues. We want these 3 items produced every single year. That means we need 3 farms. I call this a 1-2-3 method. I've heard it called an ABC method. So turnips, beans, and flax. By going to the next field, we are simply going to put turnips, beans, and flax rotated by 1 crop. Things that you need to do is add in your maintenance and your clover for all your fields respectively. Now I'm not going to waste your time with that. I'm simply going to move on to the next one, and starting down here again, we would go turnips this time in the last field, then into beans in the first field and flax into the last field, again remembering your maintenance and your clover. Now with this, you're going to have a rotation that is going to take care of your fertility, your weed level, and your rockiness, and that brings us down to the soil mixture. Now the soil mixture, the reason that I recommended turnips has to do with with turnips has a better composition with the other vegetables than peas does. If you were to run peas instead of turnips, what you'd want to do is look at your big heavy hitter crops, things like your beans, and you'd want to pair your two biggest and you'd want to get your bar mashed up. So for this one, you can see that the bar has a lot of clay in the ground versus a lot of soil, and you can see the bar needs to move to the right quite a bit. So we would need to add soil, sand, in order to get it to be fertility bonus. And what we want to do is we want to go until we see target bonus plus 10%. Once we select our other crops, you'll see that it happens to fall into that plus 10 as well. And if we go over to the turnips, you can see that it is plus 10%. Now you kind of want to tinker with this until all of your crops are within that range, with the exception of peas, but this will get you the biggest yield once all of your fertility, weeds, and rockiness are under control. So letting this run a little bit, we kind of shift over to these fields over here, which have been running for a while, and you can see we are at fertility 100% with a weed level of 1% and a rockiness of 1. If we were to look at something like the carrots, we would see that the production, we planted 108 with a projected yield of 1,119. How that is affected is we get a 10% bonus for fertility, we get a 10% bonus for the weed level and the rock level and the soil bonus. From here, we need to talk about spoilage. Now the spoilage is broken down by the same categories as what I talked about before. Starting with the greens, your leeks and your cabbage, they have a 4-month spoil timer, meaning that if you can avoid growing your leeks and cabbage, avoid them. Moving up in the world to our beans and peas, they have a 1-year spoil timer, making them much better for keeping in those root cellars. Now moving to the best category, we have the root vegetable at a 1.5 years. With this, grain is kind of in a category of all of its own, as it's not stored in the root cellar, stored in a silo, but it also has a 1.5 years. And once you grind it into flour, the flour has a 1.5 years. That's kind of the spoilage timer to help you out, which is why I recommend, if you can avoid growing greens, avoid growing greens. All right, guys, a huge fan of the channel, Banlish, has been streaming this over on Twitch. He's been a huge supporter, and I'd like to show him a little bit of love. If you are catching this the day this goes live, I believe he will be streaming this that same day. Check the description down below. I'll leave a link to his Twitch page, as again, he's been a huge supporter of the channel, and I'd like to pay this back. So thank you, Banlish. This one's for you.